Dean Foster has written the Global Etiquette Guides. Instead of telling you how to get around, I tell you how to get along. Is there like a courtesy code that you should use? Or?
Well, I think it's really important just to go with a sense of humility. Understand that there are differences and that people do behave differently in different places. And it's easy sometimes in this global world to assume that people are really all the same and that their behaviors will be all the same. But the truth is that there are some significant differences. So go with the expectation that things will be different.
I'm American, I'm going to act American, and they'll just have to deal with me the way I am.
Right.
Is that okay or not?
And that's fine here in the States. But, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans. And I think it's important to always show some respect for the differences that do exist out there.
Is there a difference between a business traveler and a leisure traveler?
Well, I think business travelers need to know this because it's going to affect their bottom line. If they do something wrong, they can really blow a deal or miss an opportunity. And those competitors who do understand the culture will probably succeed instead. For leisure travelers, it simply makes for a better trip when you understand how to get along with the people. You don't misunderstand, you don't misinterpret, you just enjoy yourself more. When we think about culture, one of the models that has been used traditionally has been the iceberg model of culture. I'm always amazed that even models of culture are culturally determined. I was once speaking about the iceberg model of culture in Quito, Ecuador. And I said to the group, you know, think of culture as an iceberg. Now I'm standing on the equator talking to people about icebergs. We see only about 1/10 of what is really going on in any culture. The visible culture is the smallest part. You step off a plane, you look around, you see things, you hear things, you smell things, you taste things. But all of that is the visible culture. The invisible culture is under the surface, and this constitutes about 90% of what we really should be aware of. And what we mean by the invisible culture are the values, the attitudes, the history, the background of the people, which creates the visible culture at the top. If we know we're going to have different perspectives on these fundamental issues and subsequently behave differently in a team, how do we organize the team so that we can be effective with all of these differences? Are we an objectivist culture or a situationalist culture? That is, do we view the importance of rules and regulations as primary, or do we view the situation as determining the answers that we need to come up with? For example, I'm standing on a street corner in Vienna. The light is red. There are no cars coming. I need to cross the street. What do I do? More likely than not, in Vienna, if you cross against the red light and there are no cars coming, that's considered bad. And in fact, it happened to me. I stepped off the curb and a Viennese lady behind me actually started to shout at me in German. And I didn't understand German, but I knew what she was talking about. Here was the red light. That was a rule. And the rule said you do not cross against the red light, even though the reality said there are no cars coming. I remember one time I was on a train in Europe, and I looked under the windows of the train, and there was a little plaque, and in 3 different languages under the window, the plaque read, in English it said, do not lean out the window. In German it said, it is forbidden to lean out the window. And in Italian it said, it is dangerous to lean out the window. And I thought the person who wrote this was very culturally astute, because he realized that there was a difference between north of the Alps, which are rule and objectivist-oriented cultures, and south of the Alps, which are situationalist cultures, where the rule is secondary to the situation. Now, how do we view time? Another category of differences. In some cultures, time is in the background. It's there, but it doesn't impose itself on us. Other cultures, time is something that must be managed. It must be scheduled, it must be compartmentalized, and these cultures are doing cultures. They see time as progressive. It imposes itself on us. We do things according to our Palm Pilots and our calendars and our schedules. These are monochronic cultures. So in monochronic cultures, punctuality, for example, is critical. Deadlines are critical. A deadline in a monochronic culture is literally a line over which you are dead. And a deadline in polychronic cultures is often nothing more than a target. So if I ask Tanaka-san, Tanaka-san, tell me why you don't like the terms of the contract, what would Tanaka-san more likely tell me? Yes, the terms he does like, or he may actually say, this contract is very good. There are a few small issues that need further study, but I'm sure we can solve those problems together over time. Now, if I didn't understand this issue between Japanese and American culture, I might actually think that I had an agreement. And it would be wrong if I thought I had an agreement, because in fact Tanaka-san is telling me that there are some serious issues that need to be dealt with. I call down to Pablo in Mexico City. I say, Pablo, how are things going? Oh, everything is fine. Everything is great. You know the small fire we had in the factory last week? We didn't lose too much inventory, and we'll be up and running in about 2 weeks. And then I call Jorge, because I know that in Mexico we are harmony-oriented and we are communicating in indirect, high-context ways. So I call Jorge, you see, and I ask Jorge, how are you doing? And Jorge says, everything's fine. You know, 2 of the people who were injured in the fire, they're coming along nicely. And the hospital says they should be out in about 3 weeks. And then I call, you know, my other colleague in Mexico City, and I ask him how he's doing, and he says everything is just doing fine. The contractors are coming to repair the warehouse in just a few days. You know, after speaking with 3 or 4 people, I realized that the factory burned down. And we have a major tragedy in Mexico City, but asking each individual person, everything is fine. Things get done. You know, a colleague of mine from Saudi Arabia was telling me about IBM in Saudi Arabia. And he said, you know, we have IBM in Saudi Arabia. I said, yes, IBM's a big company. It's in many parts of the world. He said, no, a cultural IBM. Cultural IBM, Inshallah, Bukra, and Makhalesh. IBM. He said, now, Inshallah means if God wills. So, will we move the shipment off the docks tomorrow? Yes, the shipment will be moved off the docks tomorrow, Inshallah. Now, if the shipment gets moved off the docks tomorrow, it was a greater will. And if the shipment does not get moved off the docks tomorrow, it was also a greater will. Now, I said, well, what about Bukra? Bukra. He said, well, Bukra, he described it, he said, it's kind of like the same thing as mañana in Mexico, you know, the idea of mañana, but without the same sense of urgency. And then there's Makhalesh, and Makhalesh, he says, and if things don't work out, don't worry, it'll all work out eventually. The icebergs that we were talking about that float around there, the French iceberg and the Saudi iceberg and the Danish iceberg, all of the icebergs in the world today are being impacted by powerful forces of globalization, which are universal. And these forces of globalization are profoundly affecting all of the icebergs as they float through the ocean. Now, if we use the sun as the metaphor for these forces of globalization, it raises all sorts of questions. For example, when the sun shines on the iceberg, which part of the iceberg changes first? Which part melts first? The top. So those explicit behaviors of culture, the things that we see, taste, touch, smell when we get off the plane, that seems to be melting into a similarity as we go around the world. So we step off the plane in Tokyo and in Rio and in Frankfurt. And the way that we do business on the surface appears to be becoming more similar. But I can tell you, and the studies show us, that it takes a long time for those forces of globalization to get below the surface and to change some of the fundamentals of these cultures. So that while there is an appearance of similarity at the surface, underneath the traditions and values that drive those behaviors often stay frozen for a very long time. And as the iceberg is melting, what's happening at the surface is that the iceberg itself is rising. And as the iceberg rises to the surface, the traditional values that are underneath get highlighted. They become apparent to others. They come up to the surface. And in fact, what we're seeing is that in the face of global forces which tend to homogenize behaviors at the surface level, we're seeing the reemergence of traditional cultural values as critical issues to be managed and dealt with as they rise to the surface.
Most Americans are already planning this year's vacation, and if you're going overseas, you might want to consider brushing up on your global P's and Q's. What's perfectly acceptable in our country, a hand gesture or a greeting, may be an insult elsewhere. Dean Foster wrote the Global Etiquette Guide to Europe. He is in New York this weekend, where he'll speak at the New York Times travel show. Dean, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Kelly.
Well, why don't we start with a very popular Mediterranean destination, Greece. You had some interesting insight for our viewers concerning that country.
Yeah, sometimes what Americans might view as just a wave could be really insulting in some of the Eastern Mediterranean cultures. For example, if you raise your hand up like this and try to wave at someone, well, that's a gesture in Greece that traditionally has been really quite aggressive. And also, if you want to call somebody over, what you want to do is you want to hold your hand parallel to the ground, and you just want to kind of do this kind of a motion. It looks like waving goodbye, but in fact, what you're doing is you're calling somebody over.
I mean, do you get cut any slack being an American, and Greece obviously a very popular tourist destination?
Well, I think Americans, like most people, they're admired, but they're considered a little bit naive sometimes when they travel abroad, and you want to show some respect for the way that people do things in other cultures so that you can simply break out of the tourist bubble. I think a lot of people stay within a tourist bubble, and they really don't get the most out of their trip. But if you break out of that tourist bubble and understand how people really think and do things, then you can connect with the people, and your trip is so much richer.
I think so too. Let's go to the Arab world. What do we need to know if traveling to that part of the world?
Well, you want to recognize that it's very varied, and country by country it can be different. But there are some general things about the Arab world that you should be aware of, certainly as a Westerner. For one thing, you want to avoid using your left hand, because the left hand was really the hand that's considered unclean. And so always use your right hand, particularly if you're passing food or touching people or passing important documents. Never show the sole of your shoe, because the sole of your shoe is the part of your body that touches the ground, and it's the dirtiest part of your body. If you remember when the statue of Saddam came down, some of the Iraqis were actually hitting the statue with their shoe. It was really quite an insult to do that. And it was a sign of anger.
Right,
so you want to be
disrespect.
careful about that. Right. And
All right,
men
well,
and women...
Go ahead.
But men and women should also be careful about touching each other, because in some of the more devout countries, men and women in the Muslim world don't touch.
All right. Spain, also some rules to be aware of there.
Well, the interesting thing is when you compare Spain to, let's say, Hispanic South America, if you're introduced to a woman, let's say, and you don't know her marital status, in Spain, typically, you want to refer to her as señora, but in Hispanic South America, you'd be better off referring to her as señorita. Of course, if she was obviously older, then you would refer to her as señora. And if you know her marital status, well, then you're set.
Okay, Japan. I know lots of rules to follow there. I lived there for a while, but tell us what you think is the most important thing for our viewers to know.
Well, in Japan, if you're greeting someone, you always have to have a lot of business cards, certainly if you're there on business. But even if you're there just traveling casually, East Asian cultures are non-touching cultures, and you want to be sure not to greet someone with a firm handshake or a strong handshake, or just a soft handshake is good enough. If you give someone a business card, always give it to them with two hands. Receive a business card with two hands. If you're giving gifts in East Asia or accepting gifts, you give and accept them with two hands always, and never open your gift.
I think we have time for one more. I think one more, Brazil.
Sure, in Brazil, never make the OK sign like we do in the U.S., because that's really quite offensive. Better off just to smile and give a thumbs up.
What are some of the most common mistakes people make when they are buying gifts for non-U.S. clients or non-U.S. business partners?
Well, I think you have to remember that what may have a certain meaning in one culture may have an opposite meaning or a very different meaning in another. For example, I remember a business client who was shipping over a whole set of cutlery, some of those lovely little pen knives with the corporate logo on it, to a whole set of Asian colleagues. Now, the knife or a pen knife or any kind of cutlery in the Asian culture symbolizes the severing of a relationship. So it's not a good gift to give.
One of the nightmares of business travel is the corporate dinner, where you're out with people of another country who have entirely different table etiquette.
Right.
How do you cope?
Well, you have to learn, you have to do your homework, you have to know the rules.
For example?
In certain cultures, you do want to converse over dinner. In other cultures, conversation is really something that you do after dinner. You don't do it during dinner. So
Serious business conversation.
right, serious business conversation. In Asian cultures, for example, the meal is something that you enjoy without too much conversation. And in Latin cultures and in Western Europe, the meal is an opportunity to display yourself and your interests and your personality, and you do converse. So it's going to change culture by culture, and you have to know the rules.
The American style of email is never more than 3 sentences, just blasted out of the box.
Right.
What about emailing?
Well, I think
internationally?
email is great because it gives people a chance to study what you mean so that they don't have to interpret and listen and misinterpret perhaps. But for example, in Latin cultures, you want to first say something interesting and personal about yourself and about your relationship with the other person before you then go right into the 1, 2, 3 of the business issues.
You don't start it with about that contract.
No, no.
Okay.
First you start it with
Where is it?
with when you come into the States, I'd like to see you again.